Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with my Jane Austen July TBR. So this is one of my favorite readathons of the year. It is hosted by Katie from Books and Things, Marissa from Blatantly Bookish, and this year by Claudia from Spencer's Library. I will link to their announcement videos down below. There are typically 7 prompts in Jane Austen July, all centered around learning more about Jane Austen and reading her work. I kind of have a theme this year that I don't think will fit except with one prompt, but I am definitely doing the first prompt, which is to read a work of Jane Austen's, and I'm going to be reading one of the picks for the read-alongs this month. So the hosts often do pick some read-alongs of a Jane Austen work or two each year, and so this year the 2 picks are Mansfield Park and Persuasion. And Mansfield Park is one of my favorite Jane Austens, and it is definitely time that I reread it. So that's going to be my pick for the first prompt, is to reread Mansfield Park. I really would like to do a couple of videos on Mansfield Park because I have so many feelings about it. I really love this book. It is so big, and historically it is the least liked of her books. So I would really like to pay some attention to it and to do a couple of videos about it because it is one of my favorites of her work. I am also planning on doing some of the adaptation challenges. So I'm planning on watching a few Jane Austen adaptations. I would really like to watch the Sense and Sensibility miniseries because I have never seen that. And so many people have recommended that to me over the years. So that is one that I would really like to try in the coming month. But I'm also probably just going to rewatch my personal favorite Jane Austen adaptation, which is the 2020 Emma. I have to say, the 2020 Emma was definitely my favorite film of last year, and I've rewatched it plenty of times since the first time that I saw it. So I am really looking forward to watching it again. Emma is my favorite Jane Austen, so I'm really looking forward to watching that again. But to get into the main theme of my TBR. My goal with Jane Austen July this year, I really wanted to have a theme, and I wanted my goal to be kind of being immersed in the time period during which Jane Austen lived. And so I really want to focus on reading books on my shelf that Jane would have read. So that is one of the prompts for Jane Austen July, is to read a work by a contemporary of Jane Austen. But I decided to kind of go pretty far with this and not just plan on reading one book, but on reading several. So I have a lot of options here, and several of my options are, of course, poetry. No doubt I'm going to spend a lot of the month immersed in Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, who are my personal favorites. But I would really like to focus on 2 romantic poets that I haven't read very much of, but I have a pretty good feeling about this month, and that I know Jane Austen read, and that she did quote from. And I believe a couple of passages of one of these poets shows up in Persuasion alongside Lord Byron, and maybe I'm wrong, but that's William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth is one of the first generation of romantic poets, and I have not yet really delved into his work, and I get the sense kind of that I probably won't really like him as well as I do Lord Byron. For instance, I really think I like that second generation better than the first, but there are a lot of shorter poems of William Wordsworth's that I think that I can get through this month, and that I think would be really wonderful context for the time in which Jane Austen lived. There's a lot of talk about the Victorian period as kind of a time when writing really flourished, and so you don't often think of the Regency period in the same way, to my mind, but just looking at the stack that I have here, to me, the Regency period, and the period of Jane's life in particular, was really rife with a lot of great writings, and particularly a lot of great poetry. So I would really like to get into William Wordsworth this month. The second poet that I would like to really try this month is William Blake. And I really have had some reservations about William Blake. I haven't given in and gotten the big Oxford World's Classics edition of his work to kind of go with my other romantic poets yet. I did pick this up used recently, and so I thought the selected poems would probably be a great place to start. William Blake fascinates me as a person. I never knew anything about him until earlier this year. I was watching a documentary, I think, and William Blake came up. And as a person, he's a genuinely fascinating figure. He was very spiritual and was apparently very in touch kind of with a spiritual world. He believed that angels were reading his poetry and thought it was really good. And apparently on his deathbed, he had already had visions of what heaven would look like. And he had no fear on his deathbed, and he didn't want anyone else to have fear because he would tell them what heaven looked like. And he had all of these visions on his deathbed. And so apparently he experienced visions throughout his life, and it really influenced his poetry. But I'm really excited to see his commentary on John Milton in this because William Blake was actually also an artist, and he illustrated for a lot of different classics. I don't know that he did for Paradise Lost, but I'll be interested to hear his thoughts on Milton. So there are quite a few shorter poems in this as well, which I think will be really great throughout the month to just read a couple of short poems here and there. Now on to the novels. So I say every year during Jane Austen July that I want to read Anne Radcliffe, and I do. I really, truly do. And every year I put The Mysteries of Udolpho on my TBR. And this year I decided I'm not going to put The Mysteries of Udolpho on my TBR, but I will put The Romance of the Forest because this is much shorter. And so I think that I can probably read this in a much faster time since I do want to focus on reading a lot of classics from this period this month. I thought that it was probably a smarter thing to do to go with a shorter work of hers rather than Udolpho, but that is her most famous work, I would say. And so I am a little bit hesitant about this one. I haven't heard very much about Romance of the Forest, but I do think it will really appeal to me because it takes place in France in the 1500s. And that just sounds pretty great to me. That sounds like a really great setting. I think it's during kind of the wars of religion in France where Protestants and Catholics were not getting along, to say the least. And so that's a really fascinating time period to me. And I'm really looking forward to reading finally an Anne Radcliffe full way through. I have DNF'd her several times, and I've always really liked what I've read. I've always kind of just unintentionally DNF'd her or knew I wasn't in the mood for the book at that time. So hopefully this is the year that I actually do read an Anne Radcliffe. I would really like to read Anne Radcliffe because she's mentioned so frequently in Northanger Abbey, which is another of my favorite of Jane Austen's works. I do really like a Gothic tale, so this is definitely a Gothic classic. I didn't bring it down here, but also in terms of Gothic classics, I will be reading Percy Shelley's 2 Gothic novels. They're actually novellas. They're both under around 100 pages. And one of these is St. Irvynne, I believe, and that's really the one that I want to focus on. I've heard these are terrible. I'm going to be honest. I've heard they're absolutely awful, and that Shelley was definitely more suited to being a poet than he was to writing fiction. And these were published very early on in his career, I believe 1811, 1812. And I've never heard very much about them except to hear that they are not all that good. So I'm really excited to try these, and hopefully I have a different experience with them than most people did. This is one for sure. I definitely want to read this month because I really think Gothic classics are really, really interesting, and I'll be interested to see how Percy Shelley decides to do it. The next novel is one that I know Jane Austen read, and I believe she really enjoyed, and that is Marriage by Susan Ferrier. This was originally recommended to me, I think, by Risha over at For the Love of Classics. She read this last Jane Austen July and really liked it, and I believe it takes place in Scotland, and it is apparently very comparable to Jane Austen. I believe The plot, the characters, the humor is all very Jane Austen-like. So I'm really looking forward to this. I would like to get to this month. I would like to get to all of these this month. But I think this one is going to be a higher priority for me than some of these others, just because apparently it is so very like Jane Austen. So I wonder if it would be an interesting thing to read in conversation with Jane Austen's works. So this is about two sisters who I believe are each getting married to different men, and maybe one of them elopes to Scotland, which opens up a whole can of worms. So it does seem like it would be really fun, and it also does seem like it would be quite funny. Another book from Jane Austen's time period that I know Jane read that I have on my shelf is Belinda by Maria Edgeworth. Maria Edgeworth is one that I've heard a lot about, and she was very, very popular at the time. She's kind of fallen out in the modern day, but she was a bestseller during the years when Jane was living. And so Belinda is, I think, one of her most famous works. So I would like to get to this, but I don't have the best feeling about her. So this one is actually not as high a priority as some of the others on my TBR. But I do know that Jane read it. If you're interested in reading a book that she read, I do think that's fascinating. So I did find a list online of books that Jane had in her library, I think, and that it is assumed that she read. I can link to that down below if you're curious about books that she was interested in reading. This is another perennial favorite for my Jane Austen July TBRs. I also always put Fanny Burney on my TBR for Jane Austen July, and this year is no exception. I would like to read Evelina. Evelina has been on my TBR for literal years, and I just have the sense I'm going to love it. It is an epistolary novel, so it's written in letters. That's a format that usually really agrees with me, and it's apparently quite funny, quite scandalous, and this is a classic of the later 1700s, so from a period of Jane's early life. So I'm really looking forward to this, and hopefully I enjoy it. I have pretty high hopes for this one. I don't actually know much about Evelina's plot. I've just always had the sense that since it is written in letters, I would probably really get on with it. Last but not least is a beast that I don't intend to finish in the month of July, but I actually started it last Jane Austen July, and I never made it out of the introduction. And that is The Life of Samuel Johnson by James Boswell. Apparently Jane Austen was a pretty big fan of this, and I think she was a fan of Samuel Johnson as well. I have a small collection of his writings, so maybe I'll pick that up in conjunction with this, but like I said, I have no intention of reading this whole thing in the month of July. That just can't happen. Look at it. I can't hold it long enough to read it for long stretches of time. So this is one that I will have to do pretty piecemeal, but I am really looking forward to it. I would love to read a nonfiction this month, and so this is definitely a really good option for that, and it's one that I know that Jane Austen really enjoyed. So my theme this month is kind of to be immersed in the literature that Jane would have read, and hopefully it is a success for me. I tend to really like the poetry of this time period, but I haven't read many novels from the 1700s at all, or really the early 1800s aside from Jane Austen. So I'm really excited about this. I'm really excited about this project. So hopefully it is a success, and hopefully I can vlog this whole entire experience and maybe gain a little bit more of an understanding of Jane Austen through it. This year I am currently trying to read books that Napoleon read, and through that experiment I have really drawn closer to Napoleon. I feel like I understand Napoleon a bit more, and so that experiment has been an utter success for me, and I thought this month maybe I would do a smaller version of that with Jane. And so I am really looking forward to getting started on all of this. But I would love to know down below if you are going to be participating in Jane Austen July this month. And if you are, what's going to be on your TBR? But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.